There is a strange weight that follows you into old age when you realize a single word might have changed the course of a life. My name is Thomas Walker, and I am 87 years old. The apology I should have spoken many years ago is still sitting in my chest, and the man who deserved to hear it is no longer here. When you reach this age, people assume you spend your time thinking about illnesses, funerals, or the past in a gentle, nostalgic way. But the truth is something quieter and heavier than that. What occupies my mind most often is not the things I lost, but the things I left unsaid. Words that were simple at the time suddenly feel enormous when the opportunity to speak them disappears. When I was a young man, I believed strength meant standing your ground. I believed that once you made a decision, you held on to it tightly, even when it created distance between you and someone you loved. Pride, in those days, felt like a kind of backbone. It made you feel certain of yourself. It made you feel like the world respected you. The person I needed to apologize to was my younger brother, Daniel. Daniel was 5 years younger than me, which meant that during our childhood, he followed me everywhere like a small shadow that never quite caught up. When we were boys, growing up in a narrow little house outside Columbus, my mother used to joke that Daniel learned how to run just so he could keep up with me. I was taller, louder, and quicker to speak. Daniel was quieter, slower to judge people, and the kind of boy who noticed small things most of us walked right past. I did not appreciate that about him when we were young. Back then, I thought quiet meant weak. I thought gentleness meant someone would eventually be taken advantage of. Our father worked long hours at a metal factory and came home most nights carrying the smell of oil and heat on his clothes. He believed in discipline and routine. There were not many conversations in our house about feelings or misunderstandings. If two brothers argued, our father expected us to settle it ourselves. For most of our childhood, Daniel and I got along well enough. We shared a room with 2 narrow beds and a window that looked out toward a dirt road where trucks passed late at night. Sometimes we stayed awake, whispering about what life might look like when we were grown men. I always imagined leaving town and building something bigger. Daniel mostly talked about staying close to home. That difference between us did not seem important at the time. It was just the way 2 brothers dreamed about the future. Everything changed when I was 24. By then, I had married a woman named Eleanor and started working construction. Daniel had just finished school and was helping a local mechanic. He still lived close to our parents, and he visited them almost every evening. One Sunday afternoon, my mother invited both of us over for dinner. It was one of those quiet family meals where nothing unusual seemed likely to happen. We sat around the small kitchen table while my mother served roast chicken and potatoes. My father talked about work. Eleanor asked my mother about a recipe. Then Daniel said something that shifted the entire room. He told us he planned to buy a small repair shop with a partner he had been working with. It was a simple dream. Nothing extravagant, just a modest garage where he could fix cars and build a steady living. But the partner he mentioned was a man I did not trust. I had known that man years earlier through a construction job, and I believed he was careless with money and too quick to cut corners. The moment Daniel said his name, I felt something tighten inside my chest. I did not handle that moment well. Instead of asking Daniel questions or speaking to him privately, I challenged him right there at the dinner table. My voice rose quickly, and before long the conversation had turned into something sharp and uncomfortable. I told him he was making a mistake. I told him the man he trusted would eventually ruin him. Daniel listened quietly at first, but after a while, he said something I had not expected. He told me he had already signed the agreement. What happened next is the part I wish I could take back. I remember pushing my chair away from the table and telling him he was being foolish. I said it loudly enough that my mother went completely silent. Daniel tried to explain that he had thought it through, that he believed the business would work if they managed it carefully. But I did not listen. I kept speaking over him, insisting that I knew better. Eventually, Daniel stood up and looked at me in a way I had never seen before. There was no anger in his face, only disappointment. He said, very calmly, that he had hoped I would support him. Then he left. It was the first real distance that ever formed between us. In the months that followed, Daniel opened the repair shop. I expected it to fail quickly, and I told myself that when it did, he would come back and admit I had been right. That was the story pride built in my head. But the shop did not fail. In fact, it did surprisingly well. People trusted Daniel because he treated them fairly and took time to explain what he was fixing. Within a couple of years, the garage had steady business, and Daniel seemed content with the life he had built. Instead of feeling proud of him, I felt something more complicated. I felt embarrassed that I had been wrong, and instead of apologizing, I created distance. I visited my parents at different times so I would not have to see Daniel. When family gatherings happened, we spoke politely, but never about the argument that had started it all. Years passed that way. Daniel married a kind woman named Laura. They had 2 daughters who grew up laughing loudly in the backyard of the house they bought near the repair shop. I heard about those moments from my mother, but I was rarely there to see them. Looking back now, I realize how many small chances I had to repair that relationship. There were birthdays when I could have said something simple. There were holidays when a quiet apology might have reopened the door between us. Each time, the words formed in my mind, and each time, pride convinced me to wait a little longer. I told myself there would always be another opportunity. Life has a quiet way of proving that assumption wrong. When Daniel was 61 years old, he suffered a sudden heart attack. It happened early one morning before the repair shop opened. Laura found him in the kitchen and called for help. But by the time the ambulance arrived, he was already gone. I remember standing in the hospital hallway that afternoon, feeling as if the floor had shifted beneath my feet. All the conversations I had postponed suddenly became impossible. At the funeral, I watched his daughters stand beside the casket and greet people with the same kindness Daniel had shown everyone who walked into his garage. I wanted to tell them how proud I was of the man their father had become. But the only thought repeating inside my head was that I had never told Daniel the words he deserved to hear. Not once. For many years after that day, the apology remained unfinished inside me. It took a long time to understand what regret actually is. It is not simply wishing the past had been different. Regret is realizing that a moment existed when you could have chosen humility instead of pride, and you let that moment pass. The older I become, the clearer that truth feels. I have lived a full life in many ways. I worked hard, raised children, and stayed married to a good woman who showed me patience I often did not deserve. But whenever I think about the things I wish I could change, the list becomes very short. and Daniel's name sits at the top of it. If I could sit across from him today, I would say something very simple. I would tell him I was wrong to speak to him the way I did. I would tell him I admired the life he built and the family he raised. I would thank him for the kindness he showed me even after I gave him very little in return. And I would apologize for waiting so long. The strange thing about growing old is that your world becomes quieter. Many of the people who once filled your days slowly disappear, and the silence they leave behind has a way of teaching you things pride once hid from you. One of those lessons is that apologies lose their power when they arrive too late. So if you are listening to this, and someone's name came to your mind while I was speaking, do not wait the way I did. Do not assume there will always be another conversation waiting somewhere down the road. Because sometimes, the moment to say what matters is much smaller than we expect. And sometimes it passes before we even realize it was there.